everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Edible Education. Thanks for joining us tonight. How's everyone doing? Doing okay? This is a challenging part of the semester as you're kind of seeing ahead to the finish line in all your papers and finals, and not to mention all the strife in the world that we confront either personally or in the newspaper or online. But I was thinking about today, what do I do for sustenance in trying times? And I try to take stock of, as you know, what's beautiful in the garden, what's sort of enduring, and what's ephemeral or passing. And the totem in my garden is this 100-and-something-year-old Phoenix canariensis palm tree, which I feel like I'm the steward of. I just take care of it. It's going to outlive me. It's outlived the people who have lived on this land before me for a long time. Probably showed up in the early 1900s as part of a gift that came from Luther Burbank's farm in Santa Rosa, but that's a whole nother botanical history. But the other thing that I look at besides palm trees in times of trying times is poetry. And I thought I would share a poem tonight that, one of my favorite poems. It's called Of Mere Being. It goes like this: the palm at the end of the mind. The palm at the end of the mind. Beyond the last thought, rises in the bronze decor. A gold-feathered bird sings in the palm. Beyond human feeling, beyond human meaning, a foreign song. You know then that it is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy. The palm stands at the end of space. The wind moves slowly through the branches. The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. It's not just an amazing poem. That is by Wallace Stevens. That's one of the last poems he wrote. Wallace Stevens would be right at home in this auditorium. Although he was one of America's great poets, he was a businessman as a career. He worked for an insurance company his whole life, and he wrote this amazing anthology of poems, some of the most existential and spiritual poems that you can find. So if you are seeking solace or retreat from the world and want to immerse yourself in beauty, I encourage you to check out Wallace Stevens and that poem of Mere Being. So tonight we're going to talk more about entrepreneurship and what makes entrepreneurs entrepreneurial. Remember, we read this paper earlier in the semester by Saras Sarvastri, who's one of the great academics who has studied entrepreneurship. And as you know, we're on our final leg here. If you go back, last week, we had this amazing class. This was one of my favorite classes of all time. We had Matt and Kaba and Adam, three founders, and Pooja did such a wonderful job facilitating that. And then the week before that, Sonia led a conversation with Joey Gracia from Chef and Yogita. Has anybody tried Yogita's food? Anybody ordered it? Come on, somebody, did you?
I haven't yet.
Who? And somebody told me that they did. Who? Are you here tonight? Okay. Well, Yogita, as you remember, was the wonderful chef, with a S, with a she in chef. And we got a nice code, a discount code to try this. So it's unfortunately not available in my neighborhood, but I think it is available in this part. So what do you remember, if you think, and then the week before we had Nick Jamay, remember, from Sweet Green, also a founder. What do you remember? What patterns do you recognize? I'm going to ask, I'm just going to ask for your cooperation and close your laptops because it's hard for me to concentrate and it'll be even harder for our guests. So what patterns do you recognize between those founders? Anybody? Yeah.
I noticed that all the founders were trying to solve like a personal issue that they had and then bring it to more people who are sharing that issue.
Wonderful. People have brought their kind of personal gifts and talents. I was really struck when Matt from Firebrand Artisan Bakery, with his commitment to formerly incarcerated people, and then he mentioned that his mother had had that experience. So the personal experience was so powerful. And Nick talked about the lunch that he was missing when he was at Georgetown. And similarly with Kaba, wanting to feel at home with the coffee that he was drinking. Yeah, that's right. So it comes from this place of unmet need in one's life. Most great companies start with a very personal connection. Now, what about, those are founders, and Joey, similarly, he came from this food family that was deeply immersed in this like home-cooked meal that he missed. And so that was the seed of his kind of innovation. Let's see. What else do entrepreneurs do? Anybody want to? Yeah, Florence, you're one, you know.
I noticed they didn't really know how to reach their goals, but they were willing to make mistakes and try.
Right, they didn't know exactly how to reach their goals, but they took action anyway. And they were all very humble, actually. They all spoke very candidly about their mistakes. They didn't grandstand us about being masters of the universe. They talked about making lots of mistakes, but they also talked a lot about learning from those mistakes and learning quickly from those mistakes and adapting to those mistakes. So the difference between a founder and being entrepreneurial is an important nuance I just wanted to talk about tonight. And I wanted to share this piece from Professor Sarasvathi's thesis about the difference between causal and effectual reasoning. Most of our lives we're taught to reason on a causal basis. We think about a goal, and then we think about the best steps we can take to reach that goal. And that's the way you all basically got into Berkeley. That's the way you get good grades. You figure out how to get a good grade in a class, and then you do what's required. But with effectual reasoning, you basically think about what you have, what resources you have, what gifts and talents you might have, what motivation and passion and insight. And also, entrepreneurs are really good at getting a hold of resources that aren't under their control and putting those to work. So it was great to listen to Kaba talk about how, he brought his photojournalistic talent and his experience traveling around the world and seeing these different countries through the lens of his camera before coffee was even on his radar. But he had this personal experience there and this sense of this contextual kind of understanding. So I think that, one of the key things with the difference between causal and effectual reasoning is that in effectual reasoning, one thing leads to another. And if I could give you one piece of unsolicited advice for your life or career coming out of an entrepreneurship class at UC Berkeley, is just to remember that one thing leads to another, and there is no straight path there. It is all about taking action, and it's what I like to call acting our way into meaning. So if you care about impact, if you care about outcomes, if you care about changing the world for the better, then you have to act your way into meaning. And what does that mean? It means you don't necessarily know where you're going. You know where you'd like to go. You probably have a vision of the future that you would like to create, but you don't necessarily see the path, the full path there. But that doesn't hinder you. You bring your courage, and you take a step. You act. And you know, when I was studying entrepreneurship, we used to just sit in a room and write business plans. And over the last 20 years, that's changed dramatically, because now we learn that in order to start a business or create a solution, we have to go out and talk to the people whom it affects or interacts with. So, you know, no longer do you think about how to, do a market analysis, or, you don't start there. You start with creating that new product, or testing something out. And the guests that we have tonight both started that way by acting their way into meaning. So I think you're going to really enjoy tonight's presentation. Why is this important? Well, we're living in a world that is increasingly unpredictable. It's dynamic, it's complex. You've learned all semester about the way systems are interconnected. And we've talked about how we're anticipating, the worst food crisis, in decades, if not centuries now, as a result of this invasion of Ukraine. The whole wheat harvest in both Ukraine and Russia will be lost this year. And that's going to impact lots of countries in the Middle East. It's affecting prices all over the world. It's affecting fertilizer allocations. So it's important to develop some effectual reasoning so that you can learn to think and act in an unpredictable world. So entrepreneurs are probably more comfortable operating in that environment kind of naturally, but as we've learned, it's a learned skill. You can actually learn mindsets of effectual reasoning. So I just want to tie that back into your final assignment and your final paper in this class, is that I would love to see, and our teaching team would love to see, you finish off this paper with what is the next step that you would take. What's that first action that you might take in the direction of the solution that you're trying to find? So entrepreneurs are entrepreneurial, as differentiated from managerial or strategic, because they think effectually. They believe in a yet-to-be-made future that can substantially be shaped by human action. That's really the nature of this entire class. And they realize that to the extent that this human action can control the future, they need not expend energies trying to predict it. In fact, to the extent that the future is shaped by human action, it is not much use trying to predict it. It is much more useful to understand and work with the people who are engaged in the decisions and actions that bring it into existence, which is a long way of saying they collaborate. They find strategic partners. They find allies. They find people that share their vision and values. Now, this also can lead, unfortunately, to unintended consequences. And I wanted to just talk about that for a second, because I think it's very relevant to this field that we're in now, with the rush of tech and capital into food in an unprecedented manner. And as you know, those of you that know me, you know this is one of my favorite topics, but I'm quite concerned about the ways that technology grows and expands without a lot of foresight or guidance. I mean, we've just experienced this with the last election and the dynamics of social media. And so in this paper, there's a paragraph that I'll share with you. There is, however, a dark corollary to the use of effectual logic in entrepreneurial activity, since they do not assume specific pre-existent goals or effects and let these effects emerge through the process. In using effectual logic to create products and markets, entrepreneurs and their partners may also end up creating harmful and problematic effects for the society they live in. The effects they create may reflect the ignorance and cupidity as well as the will and aspirations of the people who participate in the creation of the new urns and games of the future. So one of the reasons we hold this course and one of the reasons we have a class like Food Innovation Studio or Plant Futures is so that while we're innovating, while we're inventing the future, while we're acting our way into meaning, we can also be thinking and taking responsibility for those unintended consequences. Okay. So tonight we are very lucky to feature the Berkeley Changemakers Showcase. This is an opportunity for you to hear from alumni of this august institution. And tonight we have two changemakers working in very different dimensions of the food system. And you'll hear from each of them. Then we'll take a little break. If you want to practice your thesis on another classmate during the break, you're welcome to do that. And then we'll come back and have our conversation here. So first and foremost, I would like to introduce you to a dear friend, Kirsten Toby. Kirsten is a graduate of the MBA program at Berkeley Haas, and I've had the good fortune to know her through her whole journey from student to Chief Impact Officer of Revolution Foods. And without further ado, let's introduce Kirsten and give her a warm welcome.
I'll turn this thing on. Okay. Hi, everybody. So you're actually sitting in the place, it was right over in these chairs here where I met my co-founder, Kristen, in August of 2004, as we were starting our MBA program. We had both showed up the week earlier than the MBA program started because we had to go to math camp because we didn't remember any statistics or any of the things that we were supposed to know coming into the MBA program. So a mutual friend we both happened to know, through other prior lives, introduced us and said, I think you guys are going to really get along. And that was kind of the beginning of what started as a friendship. Then, over the course of the 2 years of our MBA program, we worked together on various projects, like through the Global Social Venture Competition, Net Impact. And we started having classes together. And two of the classes that we had together, one was Will's social entrepreneurship class. And at the same time as taking that class, we were taking Sarah Beckman's new product development class. And I don't think either of us necessarily came into business school thinking, I'm an entrepreneur and I'm here to start a company. I think we both came in not knowing exactly what we wanted to do coming out of it. We both came from backgrounds in education. My parents were both educators. I, not knowing what to do after college, became an educator, worked in kind of both classroom and experiential education. So I was kind of a fish out of water in business school. I was sort of this nonprofit education type, and Kristen was a little bit more businessy. She had worked as an investment banker before getting into education and then coming to business school. But we spent a lot of time talking about, the education system. I think both of us, came to business school with a strong kind of social conscience and awareness of social justice issues and inequities that exist in our society, and had kind of ideas around like what could business do to help to change some of those inequities that exist in our society and in our education system. So as we started looking at the sort of education system, we looked at in the new product development class, we were asked to come in with a problem that we wanted to solve, not with a product idea, but with a problem that we wanted to solve. And in the social entrepreneurship class, we were asked to kind of write a business plan that was, and to sort of workshop that business plan in the real world. So these two classes actually worked together incredibly well because Kristen and I both, without knowing it, came into the new product development class, both identifying problems that had to do with food and education and kind of why is it that we have such a huge public health problem in our country where you have a whole population of kids that are growing up, disproportionately obese, suffering from diabetes at early ages. There was a big study that came out while we were in business school that said that the current generation of kids is the first generation to live a shorter lifespan than their parents because of preventable diseases. And so we started, talking about, well, what's going on particularly in our most underserved communities, low-income schools and families that's leading kids of color and low-income kids to disproportionately suffer from some of these preventable and food-related diseases. So we didn't sort of presuppose what the product was or what the solution was, but we had the opportunity through various classes to go out and we'll refer to this, to go out and actually talk to people in the real world. So we weren't just kind of sitting in a classroom writing a business plan. We spent a lot of time in Oakland visiting schools, visiting school lunchrooms, talking to kids and talking to parents of kids in schools and talking to principals. And we, kind of realized through the course of these conversations that kids who are that schools that are serving low-income kids had very few options for what they could feed those kids during the lunch period. They had, we were talking to a lot of kids in charter schools, which were, schools that are operating within public school districts, serving very low-income kids, but who had a little more kind of autonomy to make different choices. And what we heard from charter school leaders was that they had zero options of what to serve their kids. Some of them could go to their local district and kind of get the district to send food over. A lot of those districts didn't really want to do that because it's not really their core. They're not in the business of growing their school lunch program. And one school in particular that we talked to, the school leader told us, my kids, 99% of my kids qualify for free lunch at school, which means these are kids that are living at 130% or lower of the federal poverty line. So these are, poor kids, and the parents in this school had voted to not have a school meal program because they couldn't find food that was good enough for their kids. And so we focused in on that school, and we worked with the parent community to say what would that food look like if somebody was going to provide food for your kids. The principal was like, we're leaving money on the table. The federal government will pay for these kids to eat, and I don't have anybody to pay for that food. So that kind of became the genesis of Revolution Foods, was these conversations with the school and school leaders about how to sort of improve the quality of food that these low-income schools had access to. So as we kind of went out there and tried to figure out how to make food, like neither of us were chefs, neither of us really had much experience in the food industry. I had worked a couple of summer jobs catering, so I had driven a catering truck around and lugged big vats of barbecue and beans out to corporate events. But neither of us really knew anything about how to make and deliver food in large quantities. So we started thinking about well, who does that? Who could help us to figure this out, and who's kind of within the ecosystem that we're currently living in? And one of our classmates was doing an internship at Whole Foods, and the corporate office, or the Northern California corporate office of Whole Foods, it was right down the street in Emeryville. So she said, well, I'll take you to meet with the regional president of Whole Foods and see if they have any ideas of how to make food for these schools. So while we were in business school and as a part of Will's class, we convinced the Northern California office of corporate office of Whole Foods to get one of their stores to make food for us that we purchased from the store. We drove my little Honda Civic out to the store. It was the store in San Ramon. This was before there were Whole Foods at every block in the East Bay. So we had to drive out to San Ramon, fill up the back of my Honda Civic with these meals that the Whole Foods kitchen made. We drove them to the school in downtown Oakland that didn't have a food program, and we distributed them out to the kids. And this was kind of in between classes we were doing this. We were going at lunchtime and bringing the food in. I mean, it only was a couple, the lunchtime at school was a pretty short period of time. But running, that was sort of our prototype. And that prototype enabled us to both actually like touch and feel food, have kids taste food and give us feedback on it. But most of all, it actually gave us a way to bring people, because what we realized as we were kind of developing this idea is we needed funding to be able to get this business off the ground. Neither of us came in, we both came from like nonprofits and education. We didn't come with, big bank accounts that we could, bankroll the startup of a company. We actually were both coming out with debt that we had to start repaying, a couple weeks after we graduated. So we needed funding to be able to start the company. But and we were like, how is any investor gonna invest in this idea that we have? Because we're just a couple of students in business school, and how would we have any credibility with investors? But once we started this pilot program in this school in downtown Oakland, even though we were, we weren't demonstrating anything about scale at this point, but we were demonstrating our ability to create, to actually create a business model and to create a real product, have it, sit in front of a real consumer, right? These weren't like focus group kids that we were paying to be in a focus group. These were real, kids that were coming to school every day. And we've got to bring investors into that lunchroom to talk to the kids and to talk to the principal. And one of our early investors that did end up investing in that first, that very first stage of investment was there when the principal, he asked the principal, what do you think about this project that Kristen and Kirsten have started? And she said, my only hope is that this isn't just a business school project. She said, this company has to exist, and this company has to get started, and we will be the first customer. And having that first customer, like literally sign up in front of this venture capital, investor who had driven out from downtown San Francisco to come and visit this school in downtown Oakland, that was what kind of gave us the launch pad to actually invest in a kitchen, hire a chef, lease our first truck, hire a couple of prep cooks to help in the kitchen, and so we started going out to other schools in the area, and we said, we're graduating in May of 2006. We're going to start delivering meals in August. If you want to sign up, we're going to figure out how to make this work between now and then, and we got 4 schools to sign up to start with us in that in August of 2006. So that was kind of the beginning of just how we got to the launch pad, where we kind of have gone from a product standpoint. And sorry if this is small to read. We knew that what was working or what was offered in schools. I mean, everybody has a story about school lunch and how terrible it was when they were in school, and I'm sure many of you have those stories. So we thought about, how do we turn this around and make this something completely new and different? So we focused on nutrition, having clear nutrition standards that would, both be good for kids, but would also meet the USDA federal reimbursement guidelines, because in our world, compliance with the federal USDA school lunch program is the thing that keeps our engine going. So, the fact that our meals from day one have been fully reimbursable by the federal government for kids who are low income, that's become the core revenue stream that's kept our business going for the last 16 years. But we also knew that we needed to be we call it kid inspired, chef crafted. So we talk to kids, we listen to kids, we ask them what they want to eat, we find out what they like and what they don't like. We test everything with kids in the lunchroom, and then we take those ideas. And then our chefs and our product development team turns those ideas into recipes and menus and meals. It doesn't mean that we give kids everything that they ask for, but it does mean that we ask their opinion and that we ask them to try things, and we give them 2 different options and which one do you like better, and we're constantly listening to their feedback and evolving our menu based on their feedback. And then the fact that we partnered with Whole Foods in that early stage helped us to recognize that the importance of kind of building a brand around quality. And so at that point we said, well, Whole Foods has this whole list of ingredients that they don't allow in foods sold in their stores. So we took that list off of their website and we said, we're going to make Whole Foods quality food. And we copied and pasted their unacceptable ingredient list and told, all of as we were building our supply chain, we said, we don't want these ingredients in our food. So we were basically, building Whole Foods quality meals and delivering them at, USDA National School Lunch Program reimbursement rates. And figuring out the financial model has been, that's an important piece of this, because we've, always kind of designed, you kind of think about like, how do you design something that's, that kids are gonna like, and you might just like go into a kitchen and make a really delicious meal and then sort of like, oh, what did that cost to make it? We went the other way around and we said, how much money do we have to work with to design these meals? And our chef, our early executive chef, she loved the idea of like having this challenge of I've got, $1.75 to create this entree, and how am I going to make that work? And it just made the design process was designing to this set of very specific guardrails. It has really helped us to make sure that we have a financially viable business model for throughout our history. One of the things that, so as we started obviously here in Oakland, we're still based in Oakland, but we, over the years, as we started, we grew into more and more schools. We expanded to Southern California as our second market. We built out a kitchen there. We raised another round of capital to help fund the expansion to Southern California. When we went to Southern California, we had kids asking for totally different food than what we were serving in the Bay Area. We were serving a much higher proportion of Latino kids in Southern California, a much higher proportion of African American kids in Oakland. We had developed our menu to meet the sort of Oakland palate, and when we went to LA, we realized we need to develop a whole new set of menus, or at least additional menus to add, or recipes to add to our menu in LA, and that sort of inspired us to be not just focused on high quality food and nutritious food, but also culturally relevant food. So as we've gone into different areas, we've made sure that we go in and talk to the kids, understand both the sort of ethnic and cultural composition of the communities that we're expanding into or working in, and then also understanding kind of the food trends and preferences, and that's, so going out and talking to kids is not just something that happens once. It happens every time we go into a new region and every time we develop a new recipe. So that's led to our chef-crafted, culturally relevant aspect of what we do. One of the challenges after we expanded to Southern California was we looked at, okay, well, we have these investors who've invested in this company, they want to see growth, and we want to grow our impact. Where's the next place that we should expand to? And I remember the sort of push and pull of maybe we should just sort of expand within California for a while until we're really ready to go somewhere else. Maybe we should expand to Seattle or somewhere in this, or Phoenix, somewhere kind of relatively close to the West Coast. We had one board member at the time who she actually went on to work for the Department of Education. She left our board to join Arne Duncan's staff when he was the Secretary of Education in DC. And she was the person who said, if you have aspirations to become a national company and you want to have an impact on the whole country, she said, until you have a presence on the East Coast, you're always going to be this California company. And even if you have California and Seattle and Arizona, like you're still a West Coast California company. So she pushed really hard and encouraged us to think hard about our next expansion being to Washington, D.C., which we did, and that was in 2010, I believe, that we expanded into DC. It was the hardest thing we ever did, and we were, Kristen and I, the other piece of the story is that over those first couple of years of building the company, we both had our first kids, so we were raising babies at the same time as building the company. We were getting up at 3 a.m. to open the kitchen and, coming home to crying babies and all of the things that come along with starting families. So the idea of going across the country to expand our company I was pregnant with my second kid at the time. I had a 2.5-year-old. Kristen had just had her second baby. She had a 3.5-year-old and a 6-month-old. And we said, well, we're going to do it. And so we hired a team of of people in DC to help to build the operation there. But we made a lot of mistakes in the process of doing that. We hired the wrong, we sort of underhired, we underprepared for that expansion. We ended up, we rented a kitchen to kind of start the operation in DC we were like, okay, this has the capacity to produce about 1,000 meals a day. And we knew what that looked like because we were producing 10,000 meals a day out of our kitchen in Oakland, and we were producing about 5,000 meals a day out of the kitchen in Southern California. So we had this kitchen, and we were like, we'll be able to get 1,000 meals a day out of this kitchen. We went through the business development cycle in this world of school meals, and in the specific area of DC, all of the schools that are going out to bid for their food services put their bids out, and they award their bids. They award the contracts the last week of August, like a week before school starts. So we went through, we filled out all these requests for proposals. We've submitted all of our documentation to all these schools, thinking there's no way that we're going to win all of these contracts, and thinking I think we bid on about 5,000 meals a day worth of business, and we had a kitchen that was we were like, okay, we'll have about a 20% success rate. We'll fill up this 1,000 meal a day kitchen, and we'll do great. We won 4,000 meals a day worth of business, and had to squeeze that out of this little tiny kitchen that we had rented within a week. So it was the hardest 3 months of our lives, where we had to move the kitchen, hire a whole new team. We moved, the only kitchen we could find was 45 minutes away. We had this incredible experience where this team that we had hired in Washington, D.C., we said we were going to have to move to this other facility that's 45 minutes away that's going to be able to support the growth the production that we need to make. Every single person stuck with us, and they commuted 45 minutes away to our kitchen. A year later, we were able to find a bigger facility within closer to the DC area. Everybody stayed with us, and we actually, several of those people who made that move with us still work for us today, 12 years later, in this just incredible kind of feat of commitment. And it's one of those lessons of a team that kind of goes through strife together, stays together, and you have that shared experience of the hardship of the growth and the commute and all of the hard things that came along with it. But that's one of the kind of growth stories. So over our history, we've expanded to DC, as I talked about, Southern California, Boston. We built a culinary center in. We have a culinary center in New Jersey now. We had culinary centers in Houston and New Orleans until this year. We just shut those down. We had to make a really hard decision to shut down those culinary centers as we're trying to move the company towards profitability. And those culinary centers were operating at an unprofitable level, and we didn't have the cash we don't have the cash to sustain them. So we've had to make some really hard steps in the backwards direction as well as in a forward direction. And then we also have a kitchen in Denver that is a little bit more of a distribution center than a full production kitchen. But through the course of our history, we've delivered over 500 million meals. We're still cranking out anywhere between 1.5 and 2 million meals a week out of our current culinary centers. And every meal still meets all those standards that I talked about in the beginning of, they're nutritionally balanced, they're fully compliant with the National School Lunch Program, they are chef-crafted, culturally relevant, kid-inspired, and have, don't contain the whole list of artificial ingredients that we've talked about. We've also kind of expanded in terms of who we partner with. So K through 12 education is still our core and who we primarily serve. But we've also expanded into after-school meal programs, other community serving programs like senior meal programs, summer meal programs. So kids who qualify for free meals can access free meals in the summertime through various sites. Charter schools and public school districts are still, they still comprise, charter schools still comprise the majority of our business, but we have a few contracts with larger school districts that have, required us to kind of learn even more new ways of operating. We have now a team of about, it fluctuates somewhat seasonally, but we have about 800 employees today, along with a number of temp and part-time workers beyond that. And our partners across the country, ranging from YMCAs to public school districts to charter school organizations are, they're our biggest fans, and they're our biggest kind of advocates when it comes to, people sometimes ask, like, how do you do sales and marketing? And word of mouth is still by far the most kind of impactful way that we've been able to grow and expand. A few years ago, we had the really sort of good fortune of having a couple of different studies that came out. That one was here by folks at the College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley, and another was commissioned by the Kellogg Foundation and done by an independent research group. And both of these studies included, both our meals, but also other school meal programs. And they found, both of these studies found that our meals had, a positive impact on academic outcomes, as well as, what we've always kind of felt like were the obvious nutrition and health outcomes that we were hoping to achieve. I think it's, with these studies, there's like a lot of grains of salt that you have to take to look at the way that the studies were structured. But I think the directional, kind of impact is there, that, we've seen real positive outcomes in the schools that we work with. I don't have a good sense of time. What's my time? We're good? Okay. Yeah, so I'll just mention one thing, which is the last couple of years have been a very interesting couple of years, as you can probably well imagine. I think, as Will was talking about the entrepreneurial kind of mindset, being entrepreneurial was absolutely what got us through COVID. We went from, in early March, realizing that when we realized that schools were going to shut down, and schools are 90% of our revenue, if not more, we were like, our business is going to end. Like, if we don't have schools that are operating, we could have never imagined that would have happened. We thought school lunch is something that happens, at least 180 days of every year, and it's like one of the most reliable things that you can build a business on. The pandemic, gave us a real reality check, and we had a couple of weeks where literally our revenue went to like 20% of what it was overnight. And we spent those few weeks, just pounding the pavement and trying to figure out, with schools shut down, people still need food. And how are we going to be able to get food to the people who need it? Because the kids who eat our meals every day are not, even if they're learning on Zoom school with computers from their school, they're not any more food secure at home than they were last week when they were eating 3 meals a day at school. So we pivoted really fast, and we started packing meals into boxes and distributing them through school buses and school distribution sites where families would come and pick up a week's worth of food at a time. And then we also, through our, we sort of looked at the resources that we had at our disposal with, we had a lot of inventory of food. We have trucks that are kind of sitting in the parking lot ready to distribute food, and we started talking to the local cities and counties and, who were trying to figure out how to get food to people who were sheltering in place or who were, quarantined because of COVID-related reasons or health concerns. And so we ended up, within about a month and a half of schools shutting down, we ended up getting contracts to distribute millions of meals to families throughout New York City, or mostly seniors in New York City that were locked in their homes. We built a program with the city of New Orleans to repackage restaurant meals and distribute them to people who needed the food across the city, which kept the restaurants staff employed and kept the restaurants going, as well as feeding people. And we brought in a big contract through Alameda County that was distributing meals to food insecure families across this whole region of Alameda County. And basically those 3 partnerships kept us alive through COVID, and got us to be able to kind of sustain the company through the pandemic that we've all just lived through. And I won't talk too much more about some of these pieces. I'm happy to talk more about, answer questions as we, I think this is my last slide. So we're here today. We made it through the pandemic. We're back to operating with, providing food to schools. We have a couple of other threads of the story that included launching product lines in Whole Foods and other grocery stores that kind of, we've learned and failed in a number of different ways from those experiences. And we are, still here, still down the street in Oakland, and would love to have you guys come and visit.
Thank you, Kirsten. What a great story. I look forward to more conversation. Our next guest is Justin Kolbeck, who's celebrating his 20th anniversary of graduating as an undergrad from Berkeley. And he is a co-founder with his partner, Arya Effenbein, who's a cardiologist and a scientist, in an exciting new company called Wild Type, which you might be reading about. It's been getting a lot of attention lately and kind of really looking at the crisis in our oceans and the opportunity to continue to feed us with some of our favorite foods. So please welcome Justin Kolbeck.
Everyone, good evening. Nice to be back. Will started with a very inspiring poem, and I thought I would start with an embarrassing typo. So I was putting some of these pages together earlier today in a bumpy car, and I had accidentally added an S to the end of edible education, which would have been a little embarrassing given today.
It's
A little embarrassing given the day of the class. So
it's not embarrassing here in Berkeley.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. I forget where I
As a
am.
matter of fact, most of the class may be
Hey.
who knows.
April 20th. I mean, probably not the first person to make this joke in this class, right? I imagine. Yeah. Anyway,
Elon Musk makes it all the time. So.
okay.
Yeah.
So I prepared a little bit of a conversation about us, why we were around, and some interesting stuff about wild type and kind of macro food issues. But I thought just given the earlier conversation, in particular, hearing your story, Kirsten, about your entrepreneurial journey, and Will, your preface about how, what is the entrepreneurial mindset and how do people land in an entrepreneurial spot? I thought I would talk about that for just a few minutes to start. So I, from LA originally, grew up with a single mom with a bunch of kids, first generation college student, lucky enough to get into this fine institution, graduated in 2002. And shortly after I left Berkeley, I joined the US State Department as a Foreign Service officer. And I remember sitting in orientation when they were explaining the fact that I was gonna have this pension if I stuck around in this job for 20 years. And my future would be taken care of. And I remember thinking, wow, nobody that I ever knew growing up had a pension and this kind of financial security. And that was my mindset, which I think could not be so far away from, I think, this entrepreneurial spirit of risk-taking and whatnot. So through my experience in the Foreign Service, I joined because I wanted to solve big problems. And when I was here at Berkeley, I thought a lot about policy as one really important tool to do that. And it absolutely is. But I think during my time there, my first tour was in Peshawar, Pakistan. Then I did a hardship tour in Melbourne, Australia. And then I went to a place called Paktika, Afghanistan, on the Pakistani border on a provincial reconstruction team. And that year, I think more than anything, really changed my trajectory. So if you know anything about Afghanistan, it's one of the most food insecure countries in the world. And the province I was in was one of the most food insecure provinces in that country. And much to my surprise, I ended up spending a lot of my time thinking about food insecurity with the local governor there. Just a funny aside, there was a USDA advisor there whose job it was to help the Afghans in an economically viable way grow chickens. And this guy's name was, no joke, Colonel Sanders. He's a lieutenant colonel in the US Army. Can't make this stuff up. It's like something straight out of Catch-22, if you've ever read that book. But I had never seen that degree of food insecurity up close and personal And I think to Kirsten's point, I mean, it exists here in our own country. A staggering number of people are in a state of food insecurity, but there it was more than not. And so that triggered this thing in my mind about this big problem that we have with our food system at a really fundamental level, like visceral level, seeing it firsthand. I needed a break, and I had always wanted to go to graduate school, so I did an MBA at Yale, which is actually where I met Arya. Couldn't be here tonight, unfortunately. He wanted to join. He has a splitting migraine, so he had to stay home. But I met him at a dinner party, fortuitously enough, that I went to, and he was an MD, PhD, and had this great set of experiences in deep science, and we would talk for years after business school about different ideas, and he, in 2015, went to a conference in the Netherlands that was hosted by a professor named Mark Post, who he worked with actually randomly at Dartmouth, where he did his PhD. And Mark had presented at this conference the world's first cell-cultured hamburger, and it was famously consumed on TV, and people talked about it, and he basically showed that we can make a very, very similar facsimile to an animal product using cell cultivation technologies, which I'll talk about tonight a little bit. After business school, I also had a lot of student loans to pay down, so I went off and worked as a consultant. I decided I needed to leave the State Department and do something a little bit more fast-paced, but I didn't have any good business skills. So I became a consultant, worked there for about 3.5 years, and at that point, I think during business school, I was thinking about, like, when did that shift happen from, like, policy to business? And I remember I met a classmate of mine who founded a business creating like a mosquito-proof swaddle for malaria-infested regions. And it was a very successful business, and it saved hundreds, if not thousands, of kids' lives from malaria. And I remember thinking, like, oh my gosh, like, here I am toiling away in, like, the bureaucracy of the State Department, which is fantastic work, and here's this other person who employed a bunch of people, who is having this immense social change and doing it through commerce. And it just sort of opened my mind that there's this other avenue toward change-making, right, to kind of come back to the theme of this class. I think from that point, I started thinking a lot about, like, well, maybe I should just take a chance, take a risk. But it's also worth thinking about that I had also saved up a bunch of money. So when I was in Afghanistan, I didn't have any expenses, and had the financial means to, like, take a break and not have to worry about at least a few months of pay. And so that's a topic for another discussion, of maybe a more social discussion about privilege and entrepreneurship in America. But today, I wanted to talk a little bit about oceans and sort of what we're doing at Wildtype. So just a few interesting things that I've learned over the years. When it comes to seafood, unfortunately, a lot of what we eat is heavily contaminated. And this is sort of a strange thing that we just accept, right? I also have a couple small kids, and at their 6-month appointment, the doctor asked, he's like, hey, are you giving your kids fish? It's like a very nutritious form of protein. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, how much? And I said, oh, I don't know, 2 or 3 portions a week. And he said, you have to limit it to like 2 fist-sized portions for our kids. And here's one of the most nutrient-dense, healthy proteins, but we have to limit the intake by sensitive populations because of things like mercury and microplastics and other junk that just comes from the fact that our oceans, unfortunately, are now so polluted. A lot of antibiotics are used in farm salmon in particular, and it's one of those situations that's just like, why do we accept this? Then there's an environmental angle to this. There was a really fascinating study published in Nature. It's a very unusual kind of study for that particular journal. It came out last year. And they were arguing for the protection of these marine areas. And what they had found is that deep sea trawling actually releases more carbon into the atmosphere. It tends to actually be concentrated in the oceans and then trickle down into the deep sea soil, and it's sequestered there. But these deep sea trawlers actually disturb a lot of that and released more carbon into the atmosphere than the entire aviation sector. And this was a major wake-up call, because I think most people, when they think about carbon and the animal proteins that we eat, they think about beef and methane, not so much fish. So this was, really a shot across the bow and a wake-up call for a lot of people about the climate toll of seafood. And then something that I care a lot about, which is accessibility. I actually made this graph. I pulled some data from the Fed and the Bureau of Labor Statistics to show inflation, general CPI in gray, and salmon prices in real terms. And you can see, unfortunately, one of the most nutritious foods is becoming a lot less accessible to people. And so if you play this tape forward, if we assume that all of the inputs to our food system are going to continue to become more expensive, does that mean that the healthiest, most nutrient-dense foods will become less and less accessible to people? And I fear the answer might be yes. Interestingly, I found this old report from the FAO in 2011 that predicted this. It was more about beef. Because if you think about the inputs, which is land and labor and water, those things are becoming far more scarce than they ever have been. And so we should expect proteins to continue to increase in price. And so, you could think about this like dystopian future where only the very rich are eating like effectively the best foods. And that sounds terrible. So that's why we started the company, is to create an alternative to conventional seafood. And it's, on one hand, the biggest source of protein for our species, not so much driven by American consumption, but by largely Asian consumption. You can see kind of in red there how much fish and seafood comprise of the global market for animal protein versus other forms of protein. And at the same time, for whatever reason, there just are not as many, there hasn't been as much of an investment and as many seafood alternatives. So you can see a couple examples there on the right from the current market that are not necessarily the most satisfying things, unfortunately. So that's the backdrop about why we started the company. And so what we do is we use, I'm trying to get the next picture here. There we go. This is the salmon that we make. And the way we do this is we start with a young salmon or an egg, and we find stem cells, basically, that have this self-replicating characteristic. And if we keep them in the right environment, in terms of temperature and nutrients, which are not actually not that different from fancy Gatorade, we can get them to continue to replicate for years. And in fact, we have a salmon cell line that we started, I think, 3 years ago now. So we haven't actually had to look at a fish for a little while, at least salmon. So it's a lot like a starter yeast. Once you have this sort of sub-selection of cells, it can keep growing and growing and growing if you leave it in the right environment without any genetic engineering, for what it's worth. Then we train and grow those cells in large sort of steel tanks that are not all that different from a brewery tank. We drain out the nutrients. We're still figuring out what to do with that as a byproduct, if we can recycle it or sell it on to somebody else who might have a need for that. And then we place it onto a plant-based scaffold or backbone to help direct the cells and give it, at least in the near term, a lot of the structure and taste and so on. So, and this is kind of what we're able to make today. So this we made in the middle of San Francisco, which is kind of cool. And you can imagine what this might look like at scale. And the food miles we might save if we could disintermediate the sort of oceans from our food supply. That'd be very neat. So I've thought a little bit about what the seafood aisle might look like 10 years from now, or less, and what our product would look like stacked up side by side against conventional fish in Walmart, let's say. So the idea would be to have none of those contaminants that I started with. The idea would be to have a cheaper product in the end. We can talk a little bit about that in a minute. There's a little windmill there, sort of as an idea that's been percolating a little bit at WildType that I think in the not too distant future, consumers are going to demand some degree of resource intensity disclosure on their foods. So at a minimum, how much carbon went into making this product, whatever it is, how many resources were used, land, water, et cetera. And so having a cleaner and greener product with a similar nutritional profile is where we're headed. So here's our team. This is actually an old photo. We've haven't had a chance to take an updated one in a couple quarters, just to give you a sense. But it's mostly researchers, PhD types across a number of different disciplines. And now we're in the process of scaling and growing and hiring a lot more, I'd say a broader, diverse set of folks. But we're very early stage, particularly compared to your company, Kirsten. Just 5 years old at this point, and we're just getting going. We don't yet have approval from FDA to be able to sell our products, but hopefully we'll soon. And then things get really interesting once we can kind of get the products into consumers' hands. So I wanted to close with a couple scenarios, because I think this is thought-provoking. Because this is such new technologies, and I was thinking a little bit about one of the themes in your class about systems thinking and how things connect. With such new technology that has, frankly, high expectations. And by the way, let me just say, all of those big problems I mentioned in the beginning, we're not going to solve on our own. Even this new technology on its own isn't enough for these generational challenges. We need a massive system-wide change. And by that I mean conventional meat and seafood production becoming a lot more sustainable, the introduction of really great plant-based alternatives, and the maturation of our very young industry. And probably better discipline from all of us to moderate our consumption of the most, let's say, carbon-heavy types of foods that we eat. If we do all of those things, I think we've got a really good fighting chance. But it's a massive problem. But given that this is such a new technology, I think it's worth thinking about, like, what are some of those unintended consequences that might happen? So let me start with the pessimist's view. And I think there are a couple of things that people have talked a little bit about. And these are totally valid, by the way. So the first one is that it won't scale. There's been a lot of comments about, like, holy moly, this is complicated. You're, like, growing cells and tanks, and, like, what about CapEx? And you're competing against, like, cheap farm salmon. Like, is this ever going to work? And it's a really good question. Nobody's ever done this before. That's an unproven hypothesis. But I think at this point, most of us are feeling pretty good about that. But it's absolutely a very valid criticism, is that could there be easier, cheaper, faster ways to achieve some of these ends? The next thing about us versus them, I was actually yesterday at a discussion outside of Vancouver with a bunch of First Nations people talking about our technology. And I was just listening to these people talk about their relationship to salmon. And they consider salmon relatives. I mean, it's so far beyond food. I mean, it is part of their food system, but it's this deep, interconnected relationship that they have with these animals, and, you know, a couple others as well. And if we don't have conversations with people like that, who have such dramatically different views, and as I was talking a little bit, I just saw a lot of them kind of sitting back, just like, what the hell? What is this? And they're thinking, you know, and then they started asking questions about, like, you know, when we kill a salmon, there's a prayer that we give to sort of thank the land and to, like, thank our ancestors who may have ended up in the spirit of this animal. Like, what does that look like in this kind of a production system? And, like, that's a really valid question. And so that's just one small example of all of the different communities that have a stake in this game. What about all of the people who are traditionally in the fishing industry, whether it's commercial, whether it's farmed fish, all of those different industries? What happens with them? How do we get them on board? What about large established food companies? Couldn't we drive a lot of big change in partnership with them from within, rather than sort of fighting one another as a disruptor, let's say? So I think the extent to which we're able to galvanize partners as investors, as launch partners, and others, I think will probably be the difference between life and death, not just for us, but for maybe our whole industry. And then this idea of factory farming V2 is really interesting. So I was thinking a little bit about when factory farming started shortly after the Great Depression, when we realized we could get high levels of efficiency by cramming a lot of animals together, minimizing labor. And I think when that situation started, people were like, we want a chicken in every pot. We want to give people access to more protein. it was a very good idea that ended up having far-flung unintended consequences. So I've thought a lot about how do we prevent this industry from going that way. For now, we have a lot of early stage companies founded by people who really give a damn about this planet, honestly, that are not mercenaries just out to make a buck. They're putting their values into motion every day and rolling a gigantic rock up the hill. Every other day it rolls down over them and they start again. But how do we get together and put those systems in place, those guardrails that a new industry is founded with the right oversight, with the right partners, with the right values embedded in it. So when it matures, we had a little bit of foresight and we thought about what some of those unintended consequences might be. So we're not surprised at that time. So that's the pessimist view. I have to, as an entrepreneur, have to end on the optimistic view. And I'll give a couple of them of maybe what's possible here. First off, what if we could make the most nutritious foods the most accessible ones, right? So what if we could make a salmon with all of its healthy omega-3s, high levels of protein, low levels of saturated fat, free of all of those contaminants, and less than the price of factory farm chicken? That's crazy, right? A lot of people can't even afford a salmon dinner, let alone a fancy sushi one, because it's an expensive protein, and it's getting more expensive, as I showed you. So we convert effectively basic salts, amino acids, and water into salmon, and some plant-based ingredients that are abundantly available. So I think in the end, we actually might be the cheapest option, interestingly, even though we're starting at a lot more of a premium, exclusive level. So that is what gets me so excited and motivated. Because the implications of that, it turns everything on its head. Right now, a meal at McDonald's is the cheapest and fastest thing to do. But what if that didn't have to be the case? From an accessibility perspective, I talked a little bit about that, but right now, a lot of, even in this country, I think if you go to a sushi restaurant in like Minnesota, you're like, where did this salmon come from? Or, is this thing really fresh? That all goes away, obviously, if we can have local production and minimized food miles, which is, I think, a cool, exciting idea for a lot of reasons. And I talked a little bit about efficiency, but ultimately, we won't be successful as a business if we are not highly efficient. And from the very beginning, from today, I'd say we are also embedding kind of a full cycle, like if you want to call it a double bottom line, I think that's a fair way to think about it. So what are all of the inputs we're using, and can we create, ideally, a closed loop system where we're basically using almost every waste product that we produce and putting it back into our system? And we've got a whole bunch of crazy R&D projects underway to try to make that happen. But I think what I'm really excited about is that almost every entrepreneur in our space is thinking about building a large food production system based on 21st century values, right? When companies these days, like Tyson and others, think about ESG, in a lot of ways it feels like a bolt-on, right? Companies that are starting now, it's our DNA, it's part of our DNA. It's who we are. Of course, 50 years from now, we'll have to bolt on whatever the values are at that point, but at least now we can start with this idea that maybe we can and should and have to make a company efficient and sustainable from day one, and we can't compromise on that. So I think that optimistic case is what keeps me going. There are always the doubters, and they have valid points, but I am very confident that we'll work through this. And so thank you for listening. Thank you for putting your own brilliant minds to bear on our food system. And I hope all of you are very successful in your entrepreneurial endeavors. Be brave.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin. Let's take a 7-minute break. Come back right at the bottom of the hour by that clock, which we have no idea what time zone it's in. But 6:30, it's actually probably 7:30. 7:25. Come back at 7:25, and we'll bring your questions too. And if you want to come up here or up there. That'll be great. Hey, welcome back. I know a lot of you have been thinking about how you might find your way into working in the food world. And I think one of the exciting things about Berkeley, of being here in the Bay Area where there's so much innovation, it's such a hub of both innovation and, of course, investment capital and talent, and this nexus of research expertise and entrepreneurial skill sets and mindsets. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce you to another one of my favorite former students, Jose Alonso. Maybe Jose, stand up and wave. But just so you know, Jose, I think you should keep your eyes open for Jose. He started a company called Caldo, which I'm really happy to say also started as an idea in a class that we had together a couple of years ago. And now it's a investable proposition, and he's really looking to completely change sort of the labor and safety model in kitchens. And you heard a lot about that earlier in the semester from Saru Jayaraman and from Nick Jamay, the challenges of making food affordable, accessible, quickly, conveniently. And Jose's really put his mind to do that. I'm going to have him come next year to the class and speak for the Berkeley Changemakers. So that's just a plug. You can take this again for credit, so in case it appeals to you. So I wanted to talk about a few things, and then I certainly want to invite any of you up for your questions. We've got another 25 minutes or so for discussion. But one of the things that takes place in the process of acting one's way into meaning, being entrepreneurial, is the magic of serendipity. I mean, the things that happen when you could never predict it, just by showing up, taking that step of acting your way into the next step. And I just thought it'd be fun if you could share any experiences where serendipity sort of intervened on your behalf when you least expected it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the big ones, which you just mentioned, was when we were doing our final presentation of our business plan in Will's class here. Will had been amazing to invite a panel of professional judges, like leaders from the food industry who came from around the Bay Area. And one of the people who heard our final presentation was Will's friend Walter Robb, who was at the time the co-CEO of Whole Foods nationally. He happens to live in the Bay Area, but he heard our pitch, and he came up to us and said, how would you guys like to start a product line in Whole Foods stores? And the fact that he was there set us on a whole trajectory. And I referenced the partnership with Whole Foods that was instrumental in our early history. And that was just, it wasn't planned. We weren't like, well, let's go pitch Walter Robb about this idea. I think another one, I think part of what we were just talking about at the break was how sort of having an open mind invites serendipity. And and some of that open mind, I think about when we were operating in our second kitchen, which was we retrofitted this McDonald's over in Alameda on the decommissioned naval base. And it was this tiny little healthy food factory in this McDonald's building, and we just we were good at sort of like making ourselves known in the community, but we knew that we knew what we could and we couldn't do. But at one point we got a call from the person who was leading the head of food services for the San Francisco Unified School District, and he had heard about us, and he said, "Can I just come and see what you guys are doing?" And we were like, I mean, San Francisco provides 7 times the number of meals daily that we produce for all of the schools that we currently served. But we were open, and we said, come on over and see what we do and see how we do it. And he came and toured with us, and it was, I think, 4 years later, we called him up again and said, remember when you toured? Well, we have a new facility now. We actually have the ability to produce meals that will serve your entire school district. And we've been serving San Francisco Unified ever since for the last 7 years. So, just the fact that even though we knew we couldn't service that customer, in that moment, just kind of being open to meeting and talking to people, even people who felt larger than life at the time.
Well, and
worthwhile.
that became such a point of validation. That was the moment of national validation, because as as Justin was saying, like the pessimist would say, oh, you're good at serving these little charter schools in the East Bay and you've got that nailed, but can you do a public school district? And when you got that contract, it was game changing, because then the whole country started to pay attention. And I remember the interest started to flow in from all across the country. And then it was interesting with the publicity you got, the parents, I remember in certain parts of the country, the parents would start to rise up and they'd go to the, they'd start talking to the PTA, our kids deserve this food. And then one thing led to another. So again, just those serendipitous moments, one thing leads to another. So Justin, what about you? What's a serendipitous moment in your path?
Maybe three ones that came to mind. The first is I met my co-founder at a dinner, and I remember that night I was really tired. Just kind of felt like staying at home and watching Netflix or something. And I was like, So the idea of this dinner, it was organized by somebody, and the idea was that nobody knew each other. And she pulled people from all the different professional schools at Yale. So there's an architect there, a political science PhD student, Arya, who's from the School of Medicine, and a bunch of others. So I was like, all right, I'm just going to go. And, that dinner changed the course of my life in a very dramatic way. And now, I have major FOMO of saying no to anything. And I think Arya would say the same thing. A little bit later in our journey, when we were kicking around this idea in 2016, but hadn't really gotten started. It was just kind of a nights and weekends, sort of interesting conversation kind of a thing. Arya had reached out to a lab here in the Bay Area that at the time was called QB3, now it's called NBC Biolabs. It's one of these places that you can just pay an hourly fee to rent a bench. And if you know anything about life sciences research, it requires a lot of equipment and it's all super expensive. And so he had asked a question about whether they had a particular piece of equipment. I think it was on a Friday. And they wrote back right away, and they're like, hey, we've received your application. We'd love for you to present your non-confidential pitch on Monday morning. So they either they completely messed up and didn't realize what we were asking, or just decided they wanted us to pitch them. And I had never done, I didn't know what the hell a pitch deck was. I was working as a consultant, so I knew to make decks. And so my wife was away at a conference that weekend, and Ari and I were talking. And I was like, you know what, let's just make a deck and see what happens. And they gave us the last bench after that pitch, which was bad in retrospect, really bad. I looked at those slides and I cringe now. I got to dig those up at some point for a future presentation. But that ended up leading one thing to another, and then the company, so they offer this service where they'll actually have a lawyer do your corporate formation documents for you for free, which if you know anything about that, it's actually worth a lot of money. And this was Wilson Sonsini, a very primo law firm. And all of that wouldn't have happened if we just I want to go hiking this weekend. And then the third one, a really small one, there's another professor here who runs a food tech class, also up here at Haas. And he invited us to be a judge a few years ago. And and I was, again, so busy. I was like, do I really want to do this? But I was at Berkeley, so I was down to it. One of the students in the classroom happened to know another entrepreneur who was subletting their office space, and we were looking for new spaces. And so it's just one thing after the next. I'd like to think that it's this great grand plan of just executing step by step, but it's really just being open to these opportunities and then not saying no.
Yeah, you have to have this. Well, that's really interesting. Not saying no, because at a certain point you do have to start saying no, and switching that mindset is interesting. But maybe we won't go that direction. Let's talk a little bit about partners and co-founders, because you both have found someone else, and you've had a 16 or 17 year, business marriage to Kristen, and Kirsten and Kristen. That was also part of the magic of Revolution Foods. And there were other co-founders too in the class, and other classmates who played different roles. But it's just maybe talk a little bit, each of you, about how you navigate that. I mean, I think it's really important to recognize and appreciate that most great companies are started by more than one person. And unfortunately, our media, I always wondered, like when I was an entrepreneur, I'd go look at Inc. magazine, and you'd see one person, the superhero on the cover. And I once had a chance to ask the editor of Inc. magazine, like, why is that? Companies are founded by more than one person. There's usually a pair. Sometimes the narrative is rewritten. How many people of your generation know who Steve Wozniak was? Or Paul Allen. Anybody know those names? Yeah, a couple, but less and less. But George Gendron, the editor of Inc. magazine, said, well, when we put two people on the cover of the magazine, it sells less copies. So it builds up this kind of entrepreneurial hero. If you look now, like when you hear about Elon Musk and SpaceX or Tesla, you never hear about any other people who are usually, unless you dig into the business press. But talk a little bit about your experience as partners, what you've learned, how you grow together, how you work through difficult decisions.
Yeah, well, so I think one of the most important things in a business partnership, and Kristen and I, started working together during business school, and then, continued on, is I think what helped us to work together so well is that we had, we both had very different but complementary skills, and I think we both really sort of like respected the other one's skills, and so that, like, having the complementary skills made it so that we never really had a lot of kind of power struggle around which role each of us was playing. I remember when we sat down and we were making our first pitch deck, and we were like, oh wait, we probably should have titles for ourselves. Like, you can't just put founder. Like, you've got to put CEO or COO or CFO, or you got to have we've got to establish our roles. And so we kind of were like, well, what should our titles be? And she said, well, I'd kind of like to be the CEO. And I was like, oh, thank goodness, because I don't want to be the CEO. I was like, I'll be anything else, but I didn't want to be the CEO, and I never have wanted to be the CEO. I've always been very happy to be, I've played a lot of different roles, but I've always been, and actually she left the CEO seat last fall, and some people in the company were like, well, don't you want to be the CEO now? And I was like, no, I don't want to be the CEO now. We have a new CEO, and he's fantastic, and I've learned a lot from him in the last 5 months. So I think that the fact that we weren't, and I've talked to other people starting companies where kind of both people want to be the CEO, and they're like, can we be co-CEOs, and how can that work? And I think like having clarity about the roles that you can each play, and that was hugely helpful for us over the years.
Yeah, that really resonates. Arya is a dear friend of mine. I've known him for 10 years. So maybe one thing I would add is be very mindful about who you decide to pair up with, because business is full of strife and stress, and then life gets busy. I have a couple kids now, and it's so important to be able to have open, honest, passionate debates, and then go back to work the next day and have a unified front vis-a-vis the team. And what you were saying about complementarity really is exactly what happened with us. So Arya is a scientist, and we have a very scientist-heavy team. And until now, we have 40 people on the team. 35 of them report to him because it's all researchers. And then I had a background I'm pretty good in Excel. Don't mind sales, which is basically pitching. I'm happy to do kind of just any old job, so I kind of did everything else at the company, and I was a bunch of scientists and me for a long time, and that worked really well. We're sort of growing past that phase now, and in our case, it's a little different in that Arya is not this like kind of like nerdy guy that you're never going to trot out into a meeting because you're like afraid of what he's going to say. He's like a very eloquent, amazing speaker, much better than me in many cases, and he could easily fill my role. He's a little bit less comfortable making a budget and a financial model than I am, so I think he probably wouldn't like that part of the job. But yeah, I think, you know, I feel very calm that if something happened to me, I got like hit by a bus, the company would be totally fine with him. I mean, it wouldn't be true for him. I can't do his job really. But yeah, I think this deep trust-based relationship that we've built over the years, it's kind of like a sort of romantic relationship in a way. You want to be able to have that space to disagree and move toward a conclusion in a healthy way. I think like the other founders I've seen who have unraveled, I think haven't been able to manage that conflict and the stress very well. So that's, I think, one big thing that we've learned.
Yeah. Do you have a question? Yeah. Come introduce yourself. Yeah.
Thank you both for being here. My name is Doug. I'm a full-time MBA first year. So I have a question mainly for Justin. So I was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska. You probably know where this question's going to go a bit, but we have a very rich fish, especially salmon resource in the state of Illinois. Very proud of.
Hold on a second. I've got to turn this mic on.
Is it on now?
There you go.
Yep. So, you know, growing up, we had salmon in our freezer, and obviously, you know, touching on a little bit what you talked about, the very strong connection with the indigenous population and the salmon population, and huge industry in Alaska, commercial fishing, and so big, and the resources so rich that it even prevented Pebble Mine from going in because of the potential issues with destroying the fishery there. So my question to you and to any either, you know, cell-based or cultivated or any kind of you know, production facility, production of protein, is it, you know, in your mind, enough for it to just be a less intensive resource to produce that protein? Or is there a role to play for your company and others in protecting natural environments and spaces in a way where having a rich resource can do that locally?
It's such a good question. I'm such a sucker for David Attenborough movies. They're so damn good. His recent one about his life, where he's like reflecting back on his 70 or 80 years as a naturalist, conservationist, he's got this great scene in the end where he makes this really poignant point that if we just gave our fisheries like 15 years, maybe 10, they can recover and we can get back to the level of richness and biodiversity that we had when he was a boy. And that, I think, is the role that we have to play. Like, I don't ever want to displace sustainable farming. Just the sheer amount. So we're going to have 3 billion more people on this planet sometime this century. All of them want to eat like us, like Americans, in terms of protein intensity. Like, where is that food going to come from? There just aren't enough beautiful wild salmon in the Bristol Bay, as wonderful as they are, to feed everybody. Like, we hunt them to extinction, effectively. And so I think the role we have to play is just to take a little bit of pressure off of these fisheries. We can get people to eat a little bit less of that, let them recover for a while, and return to a state of abundance so that, you know, by 2040, 2050, we'll still have wild salmon. That's a future worth fighting for in my mind.
Thanks, Doug. Last week, Pooja asked a great question of our panelists about their investors, their relationship with their investors. And last week's speakers, like the two of you, were very mission-driven. They had very interesting sense of, you know, very determined sense of purpose and values that were front and center. And they shared some of their frustration with the representation of investors saying that they believed all of, you know, that they believed in the same values, except that they believed in impact, but at the end of the day, they wanted the same return in the same time frame that, conventional investors do. And, Revolution Foods set out 16 years ago to do something really remarkable, and there's still a whole runway to travel. And Wild Type is just starting out. You just had a pretty significant financing. Can you talk a little bit about how you've interacted with investors and maybe how you've screened investors or how you've kept investors committed to the values when their expectations or patience or timeframes might not align entirely?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when we first raised our first round of capital, people said, oh yeah, well, I mean, venture capital investors, they're going to want to, no more than a 5-year investment, and then you have to deliver a return. And I mean, we're now 16 years in, and we still haven't, delivered a return to investors. I wouldn't say that's, that the investors have been thrilled about that, but they also have been very understanding of, we've had opportunities and to, provide an exit of one kind or another, and to some or all investors. And across the board, investors have said the only exit that we want is one that's going to preserve the mission of the company. And we now have a lot of different investors. We have some of our earlier stage venture capital investors. We have some larger kind of family offices. We have some foundations who are invested in us, who invested not as like a PRI, but as a part of their kind of investment portfolio. And so the values alignment of those, and like anybody who's raising money, it can be so tempting to just sort of take the dollars because you need the dollars. And we've been, we've had the fortune to be able to be, choosy and selective about who we take those dollars from, and the people behind the dollars really do matter. And I think that we've been just, incredibly lucky to have a group of investors who really do fundamentally believe that the mission of the company is, the mission and the brand are one and the same. And so you can't kind of like, you can't sort of sell the value of the brand without keeping the mission intact. And our investors absolutely believe that. And I think, would only take a return on their investment if it's, if it is going to maintain the true kind of values of the company in an intact way.
It's only been really in the last 10 years that major pension funds have changed their investment criteria to be able to include, impact or non-financial return as having a benefit. And I remember back in 2007, 2008, when I was raising the venture capital firm Physic Ventures, which subsequently went on to invest in Revolution Foods, but I was having a conversation with the chief investment officer at CalSTRS, which is a huge fund that basically manages the pensions of the California State Teachers Association. It was very interesting because they said to me, we really love what Revolution Foods is doing, but we can't really invest in a company that isn't fully focused on maximizing returns. It was ironic.
So ironic.
And they wanted to put Revolution Foods sort of like in their annual report saying that like they were doing the right things. And it was even more ironic because these were the teachers, whose students were benefiting from this. But then a few years later, what's called the ERISA laws changed, and they rewrote the definition that these public pension funds could use to invest in companies that had explicitly stated impact goals.
I mean, I would plus one everything you said. The only thing I would add is based on your point about the people behind the funds matter. If you can find people that believe in you as the entrepreneur and want to invest in you and care about you as a person, get those people on your board. Because there's so many tough things that you'll face. And we have small group of people who I would kind of put into that camp that just want to believe in us and will back us even if they think we're making a kind of a crazy decision. So if you have the ability to really connect with someone, choose them, even over a better term sheet.
Thank you. Any other questions from students? You're quiet tonight. Oh, here's one. Mark, you want to come up to the mic? Can you slip out? No, or I'll bring the mic to you. I'll bring the mic to you.
Yeah, I'll meet you halfway.
There you go.
That sounds successful. Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much for coming out. Really appreciated the lecture. I heard a lot tonight. It kind of seems like this tension behind efficiency and resiliency, and that was a theme I've heard talked about in past guest lectures. And so I'm curious, where do you find that opportunity to be resilient? Because in a way, we have to be super efficient of resources, right? But when we're too efficient, it's, you can't bounce back from it so much. Like I think food distribution was an example I've heard in the past class where we had it designed so efficiently to get the grocery stores, the big, distributors, but getting it to more immediate locations, more intimate locations outside of that system, it kind of failed. So I'm just curious if anything you can comment on that within your businesses, or maybe a time when you made a decision that didn't seem to be so efficient, but you knew in the back of your head, like, that's going to serve me later on. It will build into my resiliency in the business. Thank you.
That's a good question. I mean, I think this is maybe sort of unique to our business model, but one of the things that we've been able to do, which is I think different from a lot of sort of like, consumer packaged goods food companies, is that because we have a really broad menu of what we offer every, week and every month, we have a lot of resiliency in our supply chain because, we've had everything from like the orange crop froze, a few years ago. So orange prices went out the roof to, oil prices go up. And, so there's all these sort of like shocks that happen in the supply chain. And if you're a company that's like dependent on, sunflower oil, that like 90% of the sunflower oil comes out of the Ukraine. So companies that are dependent on that they're really hurting right now. We have this ability to sort of move and flex our menu based on where costs are in the supply chain. So we could take oranges off the menu for a month and be fine. Whereas if you're like an orange juice company, you're going to be hosed that, with that kind of a frost in the orange crop or something like that. So I just think, I know that that's kind of unique to the type of food business that we are, but I think that there probably are ways of sort of thinking about that, building resiliency into your supply chain in different ways, whether it's with diversity of suppliers or, sort of not becoming kind of one-threaded and being totally dependent on one type of supply is, probably relevant for a lot of different kinds of companies.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's have a big hand for our Berkeley Changemakers. What a great class. Thank you both for coming. I'm going to ask Pooja to come up and help me do the attendance. Well, I'm going to the end here, so. No, I'm going to the end. Or maybe I'm not. There we go. Okay. You can do the attendance, I'll do this. So next week is our final class of the semester where we're going to be meeting. And I'm keeping this kind of a special secret from everyone, including the teaching team. But we have two very special guests next week. So I really encourage you to be here again in person. And I'm going to promise you something that I did all these years before the pandemic happened. I call it the Edible Ed Farmers Market. If you are inclined to fill out the class evaluation, you get to come up and shop at a live farmers market in the class. So bring a bag. Oh, and speaking of that, I brought you some oranges from a different tree tonight. This is from a Valencia orange tree. So you can compare those to that Washington navel you had last week. And hopefully you are making progress on your final paper. You have the postcard from the future revisited. And if you need help with office hours for your final papers, please get in touch with the teaching team right away. We're less likely to be available right before your papers due, okay? And we have one other slide here, don't we, Pooja? No. That one. Yeah, so the final paper, just so you know, the final class will be next week, the 27th. Then you have a couple weeks to finish the paper and get it in. We won't grant extensions. You know, the B courses has this funny cutoff thing that if you miss 11:59, you're late. So don't wait that late, please. You know, get it in much sooner than that. If you have some extenuating circumstance and you need help or an extension or some support, just let us know. But please do it as far in advance of the deadline as possible. Okay? And now your favorite, it's going the wrong way. There we go.
Yeah, so we've got attendance, got the Slido with the code EE220420. If you have found yourself, we have 2 classes left, so not the end of the world at this point, but if you have found yourself having to email Jackie or I about not getting your attendance credit pretty frequently, that may be because you're putting your name instead of your ID, and the ID is just a safer match, the way that we upload attendance. Aside from that, just wanted to make a quick comment on the one discussion board assignment for this week, which is the postcard from the future revisited. You may remember that this is essentially the same assignment that we had you do earlier on in the semester, and I wanted to actually call attention to what Justin talked about with the 2 potential scenarios. That was a really great framing of the type of thinking that we're asking you to do in this exercise, which is saying, take something that you're seeing in the world around you today and think about what that can grow into and what does the world look like if this product grows in a certain way or if this movement happens in a certain direction. So I just wanted to highlight that part of Justin's talk was a really great example of that.
It was. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
See you next
Thank you.
week.